One is around the ports um, and the customs area and infrastructure, transit infrastructure. The fourth one would be around information. So key one is providing a single source of trade information. Um, and that is where the single window project comes in, or at least one of the areas where the single window project comes in. And yes, the single window project is ongoing, and a number of agencies have their own standalone automated systems and are gradually linking up to integrating amongst themselves to have that integration. So that's an area that we recorded some improvement, but that's an area where we also have a lot to do in the area of trade facilitation. And the port is one on reduction in, reduction, it's not just port, but reduction in export and import time and cost, which is both port but also transit. So the road to the ports, the entire road from the farm gate to the ports and beyond, and the cost as well. And although if you take the access road to the ports, for instance, you've got contracts in place to renovate those roads. It is still work in progress. The rail project to the port is also work in progress. But again, I guess the key point is that this is work being done. The port process system is another key area where if you look at where we are versus where the other ports are, there are improvements that we need to make, especially if you compare ourselves with comparable ports like Benin Republic and Co. So again, the dwell time at the port is an area that we have some improvements to do. The Interstate Road Transit Scheme is yet another area that is work in progress and that needs to be fast tracked for us to improve in the area of trade facilitation. And then the last part I will talk about is the area of customs cooperation, and which at the moment we have that kind of customs cooperation agreement with the Republic, which we now need to extend to the rest of Africa with the coming of AfCFTA, and this is important. This is important from the process, from the standpoint of being able to share information among customs agencies, being able to understand movement of goods, and being able to track transshipment of goods and what have you. So this is also another key area. Now, part of what we are doing not in that safeguard area is making sure that we have a trade remedies authority in place that would keep a track on those movements. But really, having that the customs cooperation agreement is and harmonizing data requirements, which is ongoing as part of the ACIOE, is something that is critical for us in the area of customs cooperation. So I think there are some required improvements in policies. There are required improvements in the area of infrastructure, like I've mentioned. there are improvements in the key trade facilitation indicators that are being worked on by the National Trade Facilitation Committee as we go. So, but indeed, there's a lot being done, and there's a lot that still needs to be done. The customs project, customs program, will solve some of the issues. Having scanners to reduce fiscal inspection at the ports is another critical thing that will go a long way in improving our score in terms of trade facilitation. I think I will stop here, and we'll take questions as we go along.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I actually have one more question for you before I go to my next speaker. Now, Nigeria accounts for about 15% of this potential 1.3 billion people market that the trade agreement is going to expose. Nigeria is probably the most attractive when it comes to its consumer market size, right? If the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is fully implemented, it is assumed that manufacturers across other African markets would target Nigeria's consumer market. I can clearly see how this could affect investments into specific industries in Nigeria, as investors may be inclined to invest in other manufacturing hubs across Africa. Now, my question is, what do you see as immediate challenges that this could pose to Nigeria's investment climate, and what steps are being taken to ensure that we do not lose out?
Okay, thank you for that. I think the first point to note is the effect. The trade is dynamic. The effects of this agreement will also be dynamic. That is point number one. What that means is that there will be some immediate gains or losses. There will be mid-term gains, and there will be long-term gains. That's number one thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that no African country is self-sufficient in any product. We import over around 85% of what we do. On an average, we import over 85% of what we use in Africa from outside Africa. So the concern should be outside Africa, not Africa. So not even South Africa or Egypt combined has enough to saturate the Nigerian market. That's the second thing to bear in mind. The third thing to bear in mind is that if indeed you're able to source products cheaper from African countries that you would have sourced from China, then the local manufacturers will be reducing their cost of production. Now, that said, for inputs, that said, for the local manufacturers as well, we'll need to look outwards too, and there are segments or product areas where we have competitive advantage and can move into Africa straight away. There are some strategic sectors where, because they are strategic and they are infant sectors, they are in the exclusive or sensitive list and will not be subject to liberalization immediately. So, and the third thing, going back to my point one, is that if you take a value chain approach, then you would see that what we need to do is identify those specific areas where we have competitive advantage and focus on them and help those sectors that do not have the advantages either to scale up or to move to areas where we have competitive advantage. So there's a need for us to support some of the manufacturing sectors for AfCFTA. So that's another point to bear in mind. The last point is that it's not only manufacturing. There is manufacturing. There are services and services for there's agriculture. There's and services, and services contribute over 50%. In agriculture, we have food security. So there are some product lines that we must protect. When I say protect, we must support from a food security perspective. There are areas we must protect or support from well-being perspective given COVID-19. So really, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but bearing in mind that we get started, some of the impacts will become obvious as we go along, and the policy direction will have to adapt to take into consideration how this material, how things work out, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Thank you. So I'm going to come back to you shortly, but let me ask Mr. Peter Joy. Could you please walk us through the supporting role of ECOWAS in the implementation of the AfCFTA, and also highlight, if you can, new regional trade policies and how they would aid and align with this trade agreement?
Thank you very much. So my name is Peter Joy Sewono, and I'm from the ECOWAS Commission. Our sincerest apologies. The commissioner is not available to participate because he has another equally important meeting he's attending outside of Abuja. So in that instance, he has delegated that I participate and then share with you in terms of the role of ECOWAS in terms of the AfCFTA implementation. So basically, what I'm going to be doing is to share with you in terms of what we have done. As some of you may have heard, the AfCFTA negotiations and then the implementation primarily member state driven. So the question then would come, ECOWAS, what role do you have to play? What role, even if there is, do you have in this entire process, and what were we doing when the negotiations were ongoing? So before I come to our role in terms of the implementation and then the negotiation of the AfCFTA, let me first start off by just highlighting the current status in terms of where we are currently, and then that then can inform our discussions on what role we played in the negotiation and then the implementation. Okay, so to start off, as some of you may have heard or you already know, do know from literature, in terms of the signatures that we have in across Africa, there are about 54 signatures. You may have heard from March 2018, we had 40, then jumped up. So currently we have 54 out of 55. It's only the state of Eritrea that is not a signatory to the AfCFTA agreement. If you look at the ECOWAS region, all our member states are signatories to the AfCFTA agreement. So in other words, out of that 54, 15 ECOWAS member states, if you also come to the state parties in terms of ratifications, you may have also heard, currently in Africa, we have about 36 or 37 ratifications. In terms of state parties, for those of you that may have participated in the African Union Summit on the AfCFTA on Saturday, you may have heard, currently we have 34. It used to be 33, but in the morning of that meeting, of the summit meeting, Nigeria deposited instruments of ratification, bringing the number to 34. Yes, so that's how it stands across Africa. If you come to the ECOWAS region, we have 12 of our member states that are state parties to the agreement. The only remainder that we have is Benin, we have Guinea-Bissau, and then Liberia. But then, as you may have also heard from the summit, when the president, His Excellency, the president of Liberia, took the floor, the indication he gave to his colleague excellencies was that their parliament is currently on recess, and that once they resume in January, they are going to take steps to make sure they ratify and then take additional steps for them to deposit their instruments of ratification. The reason why for ECOWAS, in the ECOWAS Commission, or us in ECOWAS, this is a major concern for us, is that we are a customs union. In a customs union, you have to go together, which is why we're happy when all our member states became signatories to the agreement, which is why, if some of you may recall, in the recent summit that took place in Niamey, Niger in September 2020, among the summit decisions, there was a decision directing, or basically urging, the remainder of the member states that were yet to ratify and deposit their instruments of ratification to do so urgently in order to safeguard the integrity of the ECOWAS Customs Union. So in other words, because we are a customs union, all our member states need to go at the same time. You cannot have a situation where some are state parties and others are not state parties. Yes, so that's the critical point. Now, the other thing you also need to know is another current information is in terms of our submissions. You know, beyond the signature and the ratification of the agreement, one of the things you need to do is to submit your schedules of tariff concession and specific commitment on trading services. And these two would then determine the liberalization effort you want to put into the AfCFTA. So it is not just the case that you sign and then you go back. It is also not just the case that you sign and then you ratify and that's the end of the story. You need to take the additional step to also submit not just the tariff concession, but also your schedule of specific commitment on trading services and the regulatory cooperation framework also in the services area. So the question then may come from the floor: what have we done in terms of the tariff concession, in terms of the specific commitment on trading services? Where are we currently? I'm happy to inform you that we have been able to meet the scheduled deadline we're given. So we're able to submit our schedules of tariff concession and specific commitment on trading services. If you look at the tariff concession, for example, what we submitted is 90%. We're supposed to submit, or we have overall 100%. We've done work on the 100%. But given the fact that the last African Ministers of Trade meeting indicated that we should submit 90%, what we've done is that we've submitted 90%. So that 90%, but for some of you, as you may know, if you look at the ECOWAS Common External Tariff, the total number of tariff lines we have in there is about 6,129 tariff lines. So out of that 6,129 tariff lines, 90% of that comes to 5,516 tariff lines. So that's what we've submitted so far to the African Union Commission. The remainder we are keeping for now is the sensitive product, as Mr. Francis Anatogo said. So we have sensitive product, which is 7%. So that 7% also translates into 429 tariff lines. So we are keeping that. And then there's also a list of exclusions, or a list of excluded products. That's also 3%. So that also makes up 184 tariff lines. Given the fact that this is a Nigerian audience, maybe I can go a little bit more by providing some information in terms of how this process went. We had a series of technical meetings on the tariff concession. So what happened thereafter was that we submitted this to our ministers. At the ministerial level, Nigeria, basically placed some sort of reservation in terms of the placement of some tariff lines. In that particular meeting in December 2019, Nigeria's Minister of State indicated that they had an additional list they wanted ECOWAS to consider. In that meeting, in the ministerial meeting, basically the decision that came up was to the effect that the ministers adopted the draft we presented to them, but took note of Nigeria's concern that they had additional tariff lines. By then it was 4124 that they wanted to also be considered before they can endorse whatever we wanted to take to the African Union Commission. So from that ministerial meeting, which is ECOWAS Ministers of Trade, the decision was then referred to the ECOWAS Council of Ministers. So they also met in December. In that meeting as well, the decision was brought up as to whether we should endorse or whether the ministers, apologies, not me, but the ministers should endorse. And then, so to pave way for our submission to the African Union Commission, in that meeting as well, which is basically meeting of foreign affairs ministers, Nigeria protested again. So basically, the decision that came from that meeting was to the effect that a committee would have to be set up. So indeed, a committee was set up. So the committee was made up of Nigeria, of course, Ghana, Niger, which was the chair at that time, and then the ECOWAS Commission being the secretariat. So the task of the committee was basically to look at Nigeria's concern and see the possibility of resolving the impasse we had. The same decision was then taken up to the summit. Summit also said the same thing, that we should look at the possibility of also resolving Nigeria's problem with a view to us presenting a single offer to the African Union Commission. Thereafter, we got back to work. So the ministers met and then they gave the technical experts directives in terms of what to do. I remember that very first meeting, the decision was that if Nigeria can reduce the 41 to 10 and then the 24 to 5, and then Nigeria was expected to undertake stakeholder consultation and then get back. I think in January, Nigeria then reported back that they undertook stakeholder consultations, but they were unable to reduce the list from 41 to 10 and from 24 to 5. So what then the president of the ECOWAS Commission then directed was for us to go back to the negotiating table at the technical level between the ECOWAS Commission and then technical experts led by the chief trade negotiator for Nigeria, Mr. Victor Lima. So we went through a series of meetings, right from January until now. I think roughly we had about 10 or 11 meetings at the technical level, trying to resolve this. In the end, we're able to resolve the challenges on the tariff concessions. So that gives us the 90% to submit, and then the remainder we are keeping up. Now, if I could also go to the specific commitments on trading services, you would also recall that in 2018, specifically July in Nouakchott, the African Union Summit adopted 5 priority sectors. So basically in the services area, we have 12 broad sectors from the WTO, but they said we should start with 5 and then progressively we can complete the remainder. So with the adoption of that 5, in the ECOWAS region, we asked our member states to submit inputs into the consolidation of the regional offer that we can present. So the member states submitted. I can just give you a summary of what we submitted to the African Union last week. So if you look at the business services sector, the total number of sub-sectors we made commitments in were about 44. So professional services, computer and related services, research and development services, real estate services, rental and leasing services with operators. If you come to communication services, postal, courier, telecommunications, audiovisual, roughly about 23. If you go to financial services, about 22 sub-sectors, all insurance and insurance-related services, banking, and other financial services. If you come to transportation, about 29, maritime, internal waterways, airspace. If you go to tourism, to about 4. So given this background, the question then would come, ECOWAS, what did we do in terms of the negotiations? As I said right from the beginning, and as some of you may have also heard, the negotiations process primarily member states driven. However, for the RECs, regional economic communities like ECOWAS, we had a role to play in coordinating the positions of our member states in the negotiations based on the existing commitment we have at the regional level. And indeed, if I recollect, when the AfCFTA negotiations were about to begin, it's actually the first negotiating forum actually took place in March 2016. Prior to that,
okay, I have minimal time left for your segment. Minimal time left.
Okay.
About 1 minute.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so then I don't know. Okay, so basically we have a role to play in the negotiations. For example, if you look at Article 85 of the ECOWAS revised treaty, it obliges member states to formulate and adopt common positions within the community on issues relating to international negotiations with third parties in order to promote and safeguard the interests of the region. Then if you go through our summit decisions, basically in July 2018, December 2019, the ECOWAS summit basically requested the ECOWAS Commission to assist the member states in order to arrive at common positions. Also, if you look at what we are currently doing, we are developing an AfCFTA implementation strategy. For some of our member states, they've already started, and I think just quite recently, Nigeria also requested for a similar strategy to be developed for them. So for the ECOWAS Commission level, we're also developing a regional implementation strategy that would then complement what member states are doing at their level. I'll just, if I have a minute, I can just tell you quickly some of the challenges. It is not all about.
Can I come back, because I'm coming back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I want to quickly ask Mr. Gumi, from your vantage point, please share some policies that have been designed to aid the eradication of non-trade barriers, such as simplification and automation of custom procedures.
Thank you, Madam. The Nigerian Customs Service has started its automation process in 1989 with ASCUDA 2.0, then we moved to 3.0, then to ASCUDA++. In 2016, the service started the process of e-custom. In the 1st September 2020, the Federal Executive Council approved the e-custom project. This project is aimed at provision of scanners in all our major ports and seaports, airports, and land borders, deployment of drones in our land borders, upgrade of all ICT infrastructure, development of our marine sector, centralized control center for images and surveillance, threat corridor in 4 places in the country, in partnership with Nixon banks, with private sector participation. This is going to be done in such a manner that the Nixon will provide the fund, the private partners will now buy the vehicles, so that we'll have controls. Once you are in that corridor and you put in your goods and it is sealed, no custom officer will stop you until you reach your destination. We may have Lagos, Cotonou, Abidjan corridor. The internal control we are going to have on non-tariff barriers is the Central Image Control Center, which is going to be here in Abuja. Once goods are released from custom control at the port or land border or airport, you will not see any checkpoints. So the e-custom project is aimed at providing a solution to non-tariff barriers. We also have a robust risk management engine that will analyze the data we have collected, then will now target a particular consignment instead of the usual checkpoints you are seeing. Then the e-custom will also provide solution for station vehicles that will have cameras because of the current security challenges we have to be monitoring movement of people in the border. And that's what we call a green lane. So when AfCFTA comes on board, all our borders will have a green lane, and in that green lane, we'll only have our vehicle stations. So there will not be any non-tariff barriers like the people, you have to open and hold your cargo. The cargo goes through the container, and the container is scanned. So definitely the control will be there. Then we are going to also have a centralized manifest of the cargo coming from both Africa region, ECOWAS, and the other countries. This centralized manifest will be seen at the headquarters. So since this will be seen at the headquarters, there will not be need for other units to stop any cargo, because if there is any infraction, the infraction will be taken care of at the headquarters level, and at the command level, all the manifests will now be seen at the central control. These are the measures the automation will tackle. Then we have mutual administrative assistance, like exchange of data. The automation will allow us to exchange data. And at the same time, it will be a non-tariff measure, because it will now aim at targeting. We have received information, a particular cargo has this or that. So instead of the normal checkpoints you see on the road, you only target that particular cargo. Then, so far, the automation process will help in no small measures in stopping the non-tariff barriers to trade. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before I let you go, I have one more question for you. So national security is still a throbbing issue for Nigeria. Although the idea of free movement is exciting, security threats still exist. Now, there's a risk of an influx of nationals within the low-income bracket from other countries coming into Nigeria on the back of this trade agreement. I just want to know your thoughts around this and how Nigeria can guard against possible heightened security risks on the back of open borders. I know you touched upon it while you were talking. If you can give us some more granular details.
Yes, earlier, earlier I made mention of deployment of drones. These drones are to monitor movements of people and movement of goods. So once you have the drones at the land borders, definitely it will take care of the insecurity we are having because of the movement of people from other countries into Nigeria. Also, I told you that we may have vehicles equipped with highly powerful cameras that will detect metals as we move. And these vehicles will be stationed in certain points along the borders. Instead of people manning the borders, now the machine will do the work, and it will do it to remove human contacts and discretions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I'm going to go to Tola Onayemi. I don't know, please, could you share with us the current status on the negotiation for trading in goods and services?
And are you on to me?
No, Tola. I'm going to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the ACIOE team for putting this together. I think it's impressive how everything is coming together nicely, especially as we all prepare for the 1st of January 2021 dates when trading in the AfCFTA is supposed to resume. So I'll just mention a number of important details. On the 5th of this month, Nigeria dropped this instrument of ratification at the making. Mr. Gumi, could you mute your mic? Thank you. All right. So Nigeria dropped its instrument of ratification at the AfCFTA Secretariat, making Nigeria the 34th country to have ratified the agreement. So I'll just mention a number of interesting things to know. So far, about 54 member states have signed the agreement. 34 have deposited their instrument of ratification. About 41 countries captured in a number of custom unions have submitted their tariff offers. And we heard from Mr. Seweno of the ECOWAS Commission talk about the process, particularly for Nigeria, where we had to go within the ECOWAS to go a lot of back and forth on how to finalize the tariff offers. The tariff offers is the indication from the different custom unions of what their preferences for the 90% would be of what they like to liberalize and the 10% that they would like to lock down. Aside from that, I think it's also important to mention that a lot of effort has been made in the last few months on women in trade, young Africans and SMEs more generally, mostly because, so for instance, the Johannesburg declaration was signed just this week that basically makes the AfCFTA make commitments to help young people and women take a more active part in the AfCFTA and to consciously create space for them. Another thing to flag more generally is that the AfCFTA is currently working with private sector players to design a trade portal. So I know that generally there's been conversations with Zenith Bank about the trade portal for the AfCFTA. More specifically with Standard Bank, there is a conversation about a $1 billion trade finance facility. The hope is to have a number of member states, governments, and African banks and African multilateral institutions underwrite it. And it's supposed to be a trade facility to help the 54 or 55, whichever it is, member states with the different trade facilitation issues they would have to face as they navigate implementing the commitments that they've made under the AfCFTA more generally. And the reason that's important is that you would realize that even though you've made commitments within an agreement, there's still the important part of dotting out, of fine-tuning the process in the different domestic states. So that $1 billion trade facility by with Standard Bank and AfCFTA is supposed to help, particularly with SMEs on the different requirements. So for instance, I've been having conversations with a lot of SMEs about scaling across borders, around trade remedies issues, around protecting themselves against unfair trade practices, about being competitive, all those kind of very important issues. Apart from that also, AfRexim is working with the AfCFTA on what I'll call a Pan-African payments and settlement platform. And why is this important? It's important because in the end, currency remains an important issue for trade to thrive. And what do I mean by that? So one thing you will find that happens regardless even within the AfCFTA and within every trade region is that we still use the dollar a lot as the basis for trade. So that means that if Nigeria wants to buy something, if a Nigerian trader wants to buy something from Ghana or wants to move something to South Africa, we're talking about 3-4 currencies. Without a clear balance of payments platform, you're going to either be having issues where currency will become a non-technical barrier to trade, or one of the things you would also have happen is that there'll be a lot of pressure on different currencies on how to actually make use of the trade rooms that have been created. So there's a conversation we have, for example, about designing a Pan-African payments settlement platform on the AfCFTA. So I'm going to touch on a number of other important things that I thought is important to mention. That due to the COVID-19, one of the things that also happened is that there's now a conversation about fast tracking the design of a digital trade and e-commerce platform. So previously, in this second phase of negotiations, e-commerce and trade was initially not part of the conversation. We're only supposed to negotiate around the issues of intellectual property, around issues of competition policy and investment. But now there's a very there's an accelerated conversation about including digital trade, digital markets, and e-commerce. And there seems to be a conversation about that already. And why that's important is that the AfCFTA creates a market of 1.2 billion Africans and a projected GDP of $3 trillion. A lot of those people already make a lot of trade advantages using digital trade. So when you look at South Africa, when you look at Kenya, when you look at Nigeria, when you look at Egypt, there's a lot of digital trade already happening. There's a lot of e-commerce integration happening. There's a lot of digital services happening, as was mentioned by Mr. Francis Anatogo. And so why it becomes important that in designing a trade regime going forward, that digital trade and digital commerce becomes one of the important things to start to designate and to start to clarify and to create a framework. And one of the big things that member states have mentioned, particularly the SMEs and the tech enterprises that would use these platforms, is the big issue of consistency of standards, of systems and platforms, of harmonization of standards, and most importantly, of having consistent rules applied across board. And so the AfCFTA creates one of the mechanisms to have those conversations about standardizing the rules, harmonizing the standards, and agreeing as a block for the ways to actually deal with the issues of digital trade and e-commerce, even as we discuss the issues of investment, as we discuss the issues of competition, as we discuss the issue of IP. Now I'm going to distill a bit into the issue of trade, because I think trading goods and services, because I think that's probably one of the most important things. So the World Bank explains that if the AfCFTA is implemented the way it should be implemented, by 2035, it should have helped lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty. And why is that important? The reason it's important is because what the AfCFTA provides is a means to progressively build trade among African countries. So as of today, three things you'll find is the nature of trade in Africa. One is that a lot of the trade that happens is very unsophisticated. So there's still a lot of export of very singular, unsophisticated goods. The second thing you see is that it's almost easier to trade with a lot of the countries that African countries have colonial histories with than even trading within Africa. So for instance, as of today, trade within Africa is between 3% to 3.5% more generally, intra-African trade. And the reason is because, for instance, it's a lot easier to travel from Nigeria to the UK or to trade between Nigeria and the UK than it is to trade between Nigeria and Niger, which is just a better country. In fact, to get to Niger, you probably have to travel outside of Africa and come back. And you find the same thing with Francophone West Africa and even the other parts of Francophone Africa. That's the second nature of the issues. The third nature of the issues is that the infrastructure and the logistics of trade does not exist and is not deepened. And so what you see, for instance, is that the railways don't exist. So for instance, the corridors don't have railroads that are sophisticated. The ports are still very, cannot contain the volume of trade that needs to be done. Especially when you start to talk of issues of perishable goods and all that. Now, the AfCFTA creates a framework already for that. But three things need to start to happen for us to maximize the AfCFTA. One is that, and which is mentioned, is that states have to finalize very clearly their tariff offers. So far, only 40, the custom unions that have submitted so far only cover about 41 of the states. That means that there are about 13 states that have still not been touched or have not submitted clear tariff offers. That's one. The second broad thing that has to happen is that there needs to be a conversation about trade facilitation, particularly at the border. So because what starts happening from 1st of January, when we expect trade to start in the AfCFTA, is that you're going to start to have three classes of what you call the goods that can exist. You would have non-AfCFTA goods, which are goods that are coming from outside the AfCFTA area. The second class of goods you would have more generally are AfCFTA goods that are covered by the 90% liberalization of any member state. And the third you would have is AfCFTA goods that are non-liberalized and are covered by the 10%. And so what would have to happen is that states would have to figure out the logistics for dealing with those three classes of goods that are coming in, right? Because of course, it's a lot easier to deal with the AfCFTA, non-AfCFTA goods. But the issue is this, is that with the AfCFTA, it means I can bring my goods in from any of the borders. So it means that even though goods are coming to Nigeria, I can bring it in from Lome, I can bring it in from Togo. Now, that raises the second issue of not just rules of origin, but determining what is actually an African good and what is not an African good, which is still being negotiated today, right? Because rules of origin are still being negotiated and it's been decided as a built-in negotiation system. But the second thing that actually comes in very importantly is also the issue of balancing the payment. So what I mean by that is, if I were to pay my duty for non-AfCFTA goods at the Benin border, how do you ensure that the money in the end gets to the Nigerian? Because you should designate that the end market is the Nigerian market. How do you design all that conversation? And how does that look like in actual practice? So it's easy to build a theoretical framework for that, but what would that look like in actual practice? That's a very big conversation that is currently going on and that needs to be very much firmed up. The third issue that needs to be firmed up very classically is also the domestic regimes that need to exist. So the truth is, one of the things the AfCFTA has tried to do is maintain the sovereignty of states in deciding over their domestic or their local trade policy. And one of the things that Mr. Transnatogu's team, as at the AfCFTA readiness team for Nigeria does, is trying to figure out those rudimentary details. So for instance, how do you deal with issues of rules of origin, which is controlled by NACIMA? How do you deal with issues like the port, which is covered by the MPA and the customs? How do you deal with issues of travel, which is controlled by immigration? How do you deal with issues of export quotas? How do you do issues of Form M, which is controlled by the CBN? All those are domestic issues that control the trade policy regime within a country. So it's one thing to design the framework that allows you to get your goods across the border. It's a different thing for the domestic systems to accommodate for that and come to par with that in implementation. And that's the big work that a lot of member states have to start to do. What already exists is that the framework already exists, and we have a trade participation regime within the WTO and within the AfCFTA that garners that already. But one of the things that we've not figured out and we're still ironing out very clearly is, what does that detail look like in actual day-to-day practice? What would be the experience of an SME manufacturer that makes a leather shoe in Nigeria and needs to get it to Kenya or needs to get it to South Africa, from dealing with the immigration issues to dealing with the custom issues to dealing with the NACIMA rules of origin issues to dealing with the CBN Form M issues to dealing with the port issues? Those are the domestic trade issues that in the end will underpin whether or not you survive. And like you said, Chinwe, one of the things that happen is that the AfCFTA provides an alternative of markets for people to pick from. And so what it means is that if you do not figure out your domestic market quickly, you provide alternative markets for young people and SMEs to start to actually think of building out from. Because the question becomes, I can choose to move my product from this market to another market that I think is most conducive for me to export or produce from. And so that's one of the big issues we need to figure out. The last broad issues I think, the last two broad issues I think is wanted to figure out is the continued negotiations that have to happen. The WTO experience has shown us that even after you design a product, a system like the AfCFTA system, two things that you start to happen is that in practice, when you start to implement, a number of issues will still come up over and over again. So being able to continue that built-in negotiation system that is quick and can respond quickly. And that's one of the things the ECOWAS has had to deal with in recent time, because the ECOWAS system is not as fast to respond to the changes dynamics of trade. And that's one thing the AfCFTA has to be able to catch up very quickly to ensure that it can respond quickly. Because the truth is this: all it takes to destroy trade in a country is few months of not responding to the trade problem. So for instance, if there becomes an issue of transshipment, or there becomes an issue of trade mispricing, or there becomes an issue of trade mislabeling, and it is not quickly responded to domestically, what would happen is that you can destroy trade in that region very quickly. And so being able to respond quickly and providing mechanisms that allows for a quick way to respond to that becomes a very important thing. The last broad category of what I'll mention is trade remedies and dispute settlement. And why that's important is, and I'll start with dispute settlement. Dispute settlement is important because what it does is that it ensures that even if the mechanism within the AfCFTA responds fast or not, member states can evolve the system by testing the system by going to court and pushing for cases. Within the WTO system, one thing we found is that member states have not been as fast, or African member states have not been as ready to use the AfCFTA, to use the dispute settlement mechanism. But the hope has been that within the AfCFTA system, they're a lot more willing to. And so two things that have to happen to the dispute settlement system is that member states would have to submit their two members that will become a part of the panel of the built-in panels that the AfCFTA will set up. But the second part to that more quickly that we need to figure out also is the setting of the courts in the system where they ensure that member states are a lot more willing and a lot more agile to use those systems. The last bulk of what I think is important is trade remedies, which is basically saying giving member states the autonomy and the power to respond quickly to issues of unfair trade within the AfCFTA system. The protocol for trade remedies already exists within the AfCFTA system. It also exists within the ECOWAS system, even though it's not as agile, and it exists within the WTO system. The Nigerian mechanism, which I'm helping to set up, already is being built out. One of the things we're waiting for is to ensure that the president signs some of the documentation that is necessary to set that up a lot more quickly. But the truth is, you need to ensure that the trade remedy system is robust, because without it, you basically place trade in every country at the mercy of the onslaught of unfair trade without creating a last mile system for them to protect themselves on trade remedies. The last thing I would say on this is a last bulk of work that still needs to be done, aside figuring out the borders and figuring out all those issues, is the big conversation around setting up the AfCFTA Secretariat. One of the things we're seeing that's happening is that the Secretariat is being built slowly, but at the same time, there's a lot of capacity that is required to scale up very quickly. And that's a big bulk of the work that still needs to be done around upscaling the Secretariat, hiring for skilled hands that need to be in Secretariat, but at the same time ensuring that it is a member-driven Secretariat like it looks like the WTO. Just some of my thoughts around what needs to happen going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tola. I'm still going to hold you for a bit. I'm going to ask you two questions at once. You answer them the best way you want to. So given this potential open market, how do we guard against abuse of rules of origin? Some stakeholders worry that European countries may dump their goods via specific African countries into markets like Nigeria. So that's the first one. Now, the second question is, the domestic private sector is muted. The average income per day in Africa is around $4.7. I'm sure it's even worse given exchange rate depreciation going on. In some countries, it is as low as $2 per day. Now, for Nigeria, if I use the approved minimum wage as a baseline, I think the income per day is lower than $3. So my question is, or what I'm trying to say is that demand is incredibly soft. And so this potential free flow of commodities and services could suffer from low demand. How can we fix this? Is this fixable? What are your thoughts around this?
Thank you very much for the question. I'll start with the first one. I think the three ways to answer the first question, and I'll say the three ways to answer it. The first thing to say is this: when people say things like European countries can dump in our market, the first thing we need to put in context is that the AfCFTA actually protects the Nigerian market. It doesn't make it vulnerable. And I'll tell you why. As of today, smuggling is happening a lot, regardless, right, through the borders. One. Two is that because of the ECOWAS regime that already exists, a lot of the goods can already enter your market through neighboring countries because of the ECOWAS regime that allows a number of freedom of goods. So meaning if you don't police your borders well, it's entirely on you. Now, the truth is, so without the AfCFTA, you're already vulnerable to those kind of things. What the AfCFTA does for you is that it actually places a responsibility on member states to not only share information with you, but to also cooperate in maintaining the borders. It also gives them an obligation to give him data on the goods that's coming into their borders for your market. It places a rules of origin design that gives them a commitment on what's African goods. It allows you to sue them and hold them responsible in the AfCFTA courts if they're infringing and are using that, and allows you to get remedies against them. And the other thing it does for you more generally is that it actually helps you, it creates a disincentive for smuggling, because the idea is that if normally I would have smuggled simply because the Nigerian port is probably not the most efficient. Now, there's no sense to do that because the tariffs don't exist. And all I have to pay now is the duties, which would end up in the Nigerian coffers. So if anything, the AfCFTA market actually protects you, not only makes you vulnerable. That's one. The second way to answer that question is to say that the AfCFTA, in its design, accommodates for the dynamism of trade. And what that means more generally is that if I'm an European country and you move your goods from, say, I don't know, if you produce your goods in, say, France or whatever it is, or whatever country, and you move it into an African country, First things first is that you would need to satisfy the AfCFTA rules of origin procedure, which talks about the level of domestic transformation that must happen for that good to be an African product. If you don't satisfy that, what will happen is that for every time you cross a border, you will pay duties afresh. Because let's not forget that the regime of lifting tariffs applies to AfCFTA goods that qualify as AfCFTA goods, not any goods that enters the border. So it means if I brought a goods from France or UK to Nigeria, and I want to move it from Nigeria to another country, I will pay duties across every of those borders because it is not AfCFTA goods. The only goods that I will not have to pay duties as I move along is AfCFTA goods. And even for that, there's this whole idea of designating the end market of your goods, right? Because the idea is that the idea is that the lifting of tariff only applies to AfCFTA goods, not every good in the AfCFTA region. That's a second clarification to make. The third important clarification to make around this is to say that there's a distinction between getting products from outside the AfCFTA region and bringing it to the AfCFTA region and producing by a French company in the AfCFTA region. Now, if you were bringing products from outside the AfCFTA region, like I explained in my last point, you would pay duty across every border because it is not AfCFTA goods. But the truth is, what the hope of the AfCFTA is that there's an incentive for a US company or a French company or an American company to then come set up a plant in Africa and then conduct a system of transformation in Africa or production in Africa that allows you to produce goods that are now AfCFTA goods. And let's not forget also that the responsibility for managing all of that is on member states and on the designated authorities in each of those member states. In this case, in Nigeria, it's NACIMA. In every state, there's a designation, right? And the hope is that you have to deal in good faith. And that if there are cases where you do not think that is done, you can actually do one of two things. Either you report to the AfCFTA Secretariat, or you sue them before the AfCFTA Secretariat court. And the third option you have is the trade remedies mechanism. Let's not also forget that every state is allowed to set up a trade remedies mechanism under the AfCFTA. And the trade remedies mechanism is a unilateral system to protect yourself. So it means you're not actually as helpless as you make it seem. Because if you set up an AfCFTA mechanism, a trade remedies mechanism, it means the moment you trigger and figure out that there's goods asymmetry happening that you are not comfortable with, you can actually take an anti-dumping measure, a countervailing measure, or a safeguard measure immediately. And you're also allowed to even take preliminary measures immediately. So it means if you don't have that in case, that is actually a failure of your domestic system and not a failure of the AfCFTA system, because there's as many checks and balances that already exist within the system to actually allow you to accommodate, engage, protect yourself at different points. So like I said, first, there's a distinction between AfCFTA goods and goods in the AfCFTA market. Their distinction. Only AfCFTA goods enjoys the benefit, meaning they satisfy the levels of transformation that the AfCFTA rules of origin systems agree to. Any goods that comes into the market, regardless, that does not satisfy that, it needs to still pay borders at every it needs to pay tariff at every border. The second broad thing is that there's a lot of check and balance that really exists for you to protect yourself, from the dispute settlement mechanism to the trade remedies mechanism to, in fact, the AfCFTA Secretariat mechanism. And a lot of that exists. And when you look at the WTO mechanism, you already see a lot of those tools that already exist. The third thing I've said more broadly is that it's important to understand that there is the NACIMA, there's the rules of origin custodians in each member state. There's also the fact that there is now an obligation of cooperation, there's an obligation of transparency, there's an obligation of data sharing, and there's also a clear designation of designating where the product's ending up with. And I am marking the track for each product, even within the AfCFTA. So it's not as loose as we make it seem. I find that people that make all these statements are either people that have not studied what the agreement really says, or are not as honest about engaging with it. What we have in the AfCFTA is really exactly what already applies in the WTO system a lot. And if that's not abusing the WTO system, I don't see a sense in which people would abuse it, or how you can even abuse it within the AfCFTA system. And don't forget, like I said, there's still your own mechanism you can set up as a member state if you're concerned, like the trade remedies mechanism, the dispute resolution mechanism, but beyond that also using the direct consultation and mediation that exists, and even the office of the Secretary General of the AfCFTA. On the second question about wealth in the continent, I find that in the end, there's just what they call the theory of the efficient producer and theory of the inefficient producer. The idea is simple, that trade flows will always happen. The question is where trade will flow to us, not whether trade will happen. Trade always will happen. And the truth of the matter is that What the AfCFTA is saying is let trade flow within Africa, not outside Africa. That's what it's saying. So truth is that, and because of that, what you're going to do is one thing, you're going to retain more value within the continent, but beyond even retaining value within the continent, you're also going to ensure that within the continent, there's actually increased industrialization, but increased capacity. And I'll give you several examples that I think is important. Cocoa. Today, Cote d'Ivoire is probably Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, but definitely Cote d'Ivoire supplies easily between 40 to 50% of the world's cocoa beans. However, when you talk about chocolate or chocolate powder, it controls less than 10%. Now, the real value or the real capital in the chocolate industry is in the cocoa powder and chocolate, not in cocoa beans. Cocoa beans is basic manufacture. And so truth matters, what the AfCFTA system will do is to say, listen, rather than have a system where we export cocoa beans to the world, and which is the most unsophisticated manufacture, what if you had joint production enterprises? What if you had more manufacturing within the continent to ensure that you're producing cocoa powder and chocolate within the factory? And so you're exporting higher valued exports. And so you're retaining a higher value of the entire value chain when you export. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is this: there's already a lot of export and trade that's happening within the continent. People import things from the US a lot. People import things from the UK and from Europe a lot. Cars, for instance, used cars. A lot of cars are imported from Belgium and from the European Union. What the AfCFTA does is that by reducing the tariff within member states, it allows them to actually compete. Because the idea is this: if there's already an efficient system of transportation between Europe and Nigeria, but there is not as much an efficient system between South Africa and Nigeria, there is no incentive to change that system. However, if suddenly I know that the 50% I would have paid as a tariff no longer exists between Nigeria and South Africa, then there's an incentive to actually try to use those systems. And because of that, scale up on the trade that exists. The truth of the matter is that infrastructure for trade traditionally follows trade. The more there's trade in those corridors, the more the infrastructure for building out trade exists. For instance, the Badagry tire market basically supplies most of the tire infrastructure in the whole of West Africa. So imagine that is upscaled because an increased demand is existing in that market. The last thing to say is this: there already exists a lot of informal trade on the continent. But what the AfCFTA does, they allow us to start to formalize those trade that already exist. So it's not an issue. So for instance, the person who sells wigs, the person who makes leather shoes, the person who makes bags, all those things, there's already a lot of this trade happening on the continent. What the AfCFTA goods allows us to do is that it allows us actually more strategically link those informal trade that already exist and then force us to deepen trade relations among the different countries. So and the truth is, like Mr. Frank Zonatogu said, we've got to realize that you would not be able to reserve every part of trade. And that's not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to look for is the way you're most efficient. You're not trying to protect everything. It makes no sense to try and say, I want to protect textile, cotton, cocoa, beans, everything. It makes no sense. The question is, where am I most competitive as a country? And where can I outsource and cooperate where I'm not most competitive with member states in the AfCFTA to ensure that we are then exporting to the world a more refined product and we're retaining more value. So I think the fact that per capita income or per spend is low does not change trade, in the sense that trade is still happening regardless. So the question is to say, how can we capture more of the trade happening? How can we create a system for industrialization startup? For instance, cars. Imagine South Africa can capture all the car manufacturers that happens in Africa, right? What that does is that they can upscale, they can utilize more. Then maybe Nigeria can plug in tires and spark plugs and fan belts. Mm-hmm. Nigeria can now capture more value in components. And that's kind of connections you're looking for. Mm-hmm. Connections in trades, global value chains, regional value chains that exist. And that is how you retain value. That's how you upscale wealth. And that's actually how you create prosperity within the continent.
Thank you so much for that extensive response. I'll just scribbling down in my jotter. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Peter Joy, Sewonu. An obvious challenge is poor infrastructure. There are lots of examples from countries across Africa. I think Gabon is worth highlighting. Transporting timber in its raw form to other African countries from Gabon is expensive. And now, to put this in perspective, it costs about 5 times more than sending it to India due to poor or non-existent transport links. I want to know, from your vantage point, are there specific investments targeted towards improving strategic logistics projects such as the road corridors from Nigeria to other African countries?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, so basically, if you also look at the AfCFTA process, there are complementary policies as well. So at the level of the African Union Commission, there's a program on agriculture, which is the CADEP. There's a program on infrastructure development, which is PIDA. If you also come to the area of industry, you also have a program in that area. If you would also recall, for example, when the AfCFTA agreement was presented in March 2018 for signature, what was also presented for signature is a free movement protocol, the African Union Free Movement Protocol, because they both are complementary. You cannot have AfCFTA without facilitating the movement of people. Yeah, so the point I'm making is that there are complementary policies, knowing very well that the AfCFTA cannot stand on its own. If you come to the ECOWAS region as well, it's a similar thing. Colleagues from the infrastructure department, they've been doing a lot more in terms of the construction of joint border posts, construction of assisting member states in terms of construction of road networks. Yes, it's because of the realization that you cannot just trade on your own. You need facilitating policies all across. Yes, so that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to ask Mr. Francis Anatogu, in terms of competitiveness, what sectors would be best to invest in? Essentially, what are our competitive advantage? What sectors can be lowest cost producers from your vantage point?
Okay, thank you. So I think really, if you look at it, there are some there are areas where Nigerian businesses are already in Africa. I mean so they are not waiting for AfCFTA. They're already moving, and in the services area, you think about financial services. And really, in that financial service area, if you look at the size of the market, you find out that the opportunity for financial services is in the rest of Africa, not even in ECOWAS. And I think our financial services businesses understand this, and they're making steps to expand to Africa. If you look at our entertainment and movie creative sectors, again, this from the musicians to movies and every part of entertainment, they are moving into Africa already. Digital technology, fintech, and others, they are moving already. You look at e-commerce, again, that's an area that is moving. Now, if you come to trade in goods, so there are a lot of our products that go to Africa, albeit through informal channels. So really, our food products is one area. Tobacco is another area. So really, across sectors, you can pick out specific products. But what I would say is that businesses will now need to investigate these markets, need to investigate just like they do. They need to investigate the markets and the products and identify those ones that work for their peculiar circumstance. But are there opportunities in most areas? Yes. In the logistics, again, there are opportunities. So but really, you would need to, I think the last point that I'll make is that you would need to be innovative as well, because we are moving into a competitive area. We are into competitive business or environment. So just business as usual may not cut it across every sector. So businesses will need to be innovative. Businesses will need to do what they do best, which is identify opportunities, validate and evaluate opportunities, and then take steps to take advantage of those opportunities. And they could be, for the service areas, could be one of the modes. So even if there are some you will sell from Nigeria, there are some you need to go out there in the market and establish businesses and so on. But really, it cuts across.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm going to start to round up this session so that we can go into the Q&A from participants. So I'm going to ask Mr. Francis, I'm going to ask you to please give me your view in maybe 3 minutes. What benefits do Nigeria stand to gain from this Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? And maybe give us one challenge you feel that the free trade area could pose for Nigeria's economy. Mr. Francis? Okay.
Sorry, I missed that. Now I can hear you. Sorry. What was the question? I missed that.
My question is this. What I want to trying to close up this panel now, and I would like you to conclude with your views around the benefits Nigeria stands to gain from this agreement, maybe mention 2 from your vantage point, and then 1 challenge you feel that this agreement could pose to Nigeria's economy.
So the advantage of this agreement to us is really, I will call it 1, wealth protection. And that is hedging against foreign exchange risk. That is 1 key advantage. 2 is business growth or revenue growth. You have a big market to target, right? So these 2 are key advantages, specific advantages to businesses. The challenge is we need to continue to work on our competitiveness and infrastructure and quality and so on. So really focus on the competitiveness and keep going.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Gumi, I'll ask you the same question. What benefits do you feel Nigeria stands to gain from this trade agreement? And then maybe mention 2 challenges you feel that this agreement could pose to Nigeria. Answer 2 minutes.
Yes. Nigeria stands to gain in terms of our businessmen need to be efficient. They need to advertise those for the honest. We need to have in place a clear rules of origin. A clear rules of origin that will be transmitted, not uploaded, so that it cannot be tampered with. And the subcommittee is working on it. Then we have put safeguard on smuggling, and the safeguard will definitely suppress the smuggling aspect of goods and movement of people. At the same time, the e-custom project is aimed at having a seamless procedure and process where discretion is removed, contact is removed, non-tariff barriers are removed, business smoothly, more and more investment is created for the country. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Peter Joyce Awonu, may I please get your view around what you feel Nigeria stands to benefit from this agreement, and then maybe one or two challenges you feel Nigeria could be exposed to from your vantage point?
Thank you so much. I think given the fact that my other panelists have tackled this, maybe I can also tackle it from the perspective of ECOWAS. The simplest in terms of benefits is if you're going to have access to a much bigger, larger market, that obviously comes as an advantage to your manufacturers. If you look at even the services sector in terms of the expansion of your banking sector, that also comes at an advantage. Currently, what we are doing is that even though we've submitted our offer, other countries have also submitted. So in a meeting last week, for example, in Accra, which involved all our member states, we're trying to prepare requests that will go to the other member states as well. So for example, South Africa has submitted an offer. So in the coming weeks and months, what Nigerian stakeholders would have to do is to consider what South Africa has presented, and then you prepare a request to send to South Africa. If you look at South Africa's request, for example, they had limitations in a number of areas. Nigerian bankers, for example, would say, we want more access to that particular market. So what then do we do? So that also comes as an advantage to Nigeria. If you also go quickly to the challenges, I'll tackle the challenges more from the angle of ECOWAS. But even before coming to the challenges, one other advantage that comes to Nigeria negotiating sort of together with ECOWAS is this. You know, one of the things that was done in terms of the tariff concession, in terms of the modalities, was basically to differentiate between developing and least developed countries. So in other words, if you had least developed countries, you had more years or a more transitional time frame within which to liberalize your tariff lines, and then developing countries having less. So we have, for example, 10, 13 years, and then 5 and 10 years. Now coming under ECOWAS and negotiating under the umbrella of ECOWAS, what is going to happen is that instead of Nigeria, for example, having 5, 10 years, what we have agreed is that all ECOWAS member states, because we are a customs union, we need to have a uniform period. So what we requested, which is not yet solved, but which ECOWAS will go in as a block, is that instead of Nigeria, for example, having 5 and 10 years to liberalize their sensitive and then the 90%, they are going to be getting 10, 13 years instead. So this is also another advantage in terms of Nigeria having more years within which to liberalize the 90% and then the sensitive product as well. Now, let me come to some of the challenges quickly. One major challenge is for the ECOWAS region, which also includes Nigeria, is the fact that if you look at Article 7 of the Protocol on Trading Goods, it's obliged state parties to the agreement to progressively eliminate duties and other charges having the equivalent effect on trading goods. If you look at the ECOWAS region, a charge that has equivalent effects on trading goods that's similar to a duty is the ECOWAS community levy. So what this means is that the ECOWAS community levy progressively on intra-Africa trade would have to be eliminated. But you know, for us in the ECOWAS region, the community levy is a major source of income for our community institutions. If you look at even like, you know, each member state, when you're going to have elections, the ECOWAS Commission or ECOWAS as a group provides some support in terms of these military interventions we have in the different member states. Recently in Mali, that Nigeria had to support. This is what the revenue we get from the community levy is used for. So any decision that says progressively you have to remove it becomes then a challenge for the ECOWAS Commission. And there's a whole lot of history as to how this process went. But for example, the African Development Bank had to undertake a study to then advise, and then they said it will have a minimal impact on ECOWAS. We also undertook a study which said it will have a greater impact on the region. But quite recently, our ministers took a decision and said we shouldn't implement it immediately. We should be given a time frame within which to do that. Another challenge that comes to the region is what I said earlier on. As a customs union, all our member states would have to go together. So you cannot have a situation where currently, as we have 12 countries that are state parties to the agreement, and then the implementation starting would have to go on. No, it cannot happen. So what we've done recently, even before submitting our offers to the African Union Commission, was to, and the letter from the president of the ECOWAS Commission to the chair, which is currently Ghana, was also to advise that even though we are submitting the schedules, the chair needs to take note of the fact that the implementation cannot start if we don't have all member states becoming state parties. Yeah, so these are some of the challenges from the perspective of ECOWAS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Tola, may I kindly get your view on what you feel Nigeria stands to benefit? And then, of course, maybe one or two challenges you feel the agreement may pose to Nigeria's economy.
Thank you very much. I particularly like the contributions by the representative from ECOWAS, Mr. Sewon. I think these are very constructive conversations. So a number of benefits I think to flag. One of the important benefits that I think the Johannes Declaration typifies very clearly is that prior to now, what would happen is that if you were an SME or a young person or a woman or a female who didn't have influence, accessing other African markets was rather Herculean, right? Because the idea is that so a big businessman can probably have an access to what it got, a president of a country, and negotiate special tariffs for themselves and special preferences for themselves and access. But the AfCFTA does two things that I think are impressive. One is that it allows us negotiate at a one-off for every SME in the continent. So basically it says, listen, you're big, you're small, it negotiates a preferential regime for you that allows you actually expand. So I think that this is actually one of the most definite statements of growth and support for SMEs around the continent. It actually provides a system where the biggest obstacles to trade, whether technical or not technical, are addressed one-off. The second side to that conversation that I think is also incredibly impressive is that it creates a conversation, and you see from what Mr. Francis said, is that it forces member states to actually compete. So one of the things that I used to hear before the AfCFTA is that you hear member states say things like, we're a big market, we don't have to compete. If you want our market, you don't want to. But that changes with the AfCFTA, because the idea is that if you become uncompetitive, I can move to Ghana, I can move to Togo, wherever it is, and access your markets. And so it forces member states to carefully become competitive. And I think that's a very major part, that it actually encourages the theory of the efficient producer, because now I'm not propping you up because of your inefficiency. I'm saying you have to become efficient if you want to. And that's how trade works. The market has to be the ultimate way for determining price, for determining demand, and for determining supply. And so a lot of propping up, a lot of distortion of the market actually come under threat when you start to use the AfCFTA. That's the first bulk benefit. I think the second bulk benefit that I think is important to actually state is that this is the boldest statement by the African leadership, political leadership, and the member states about a need to preserve value and to actually start the process of getting on the path of prosperity. So for the longest time, one of the things Africa has always struggled with is that we would join trade global value chains at the most unsophisticated and the most basic. So for instance, let's say rubber manufacturing, tire manufacturing would only supply rubber. Chocolate manufacturing will only supply cocoa beans. Petrochemicals and hydrocarbons will only supply maybe crude oil. But the AfCFTA provides a mechanism to actually do two things. One is start to capture more value on the continent by joint production systems, by regional value chains, by actually cooperating to create value. The second side of what it does that I think is particularly instructive is that it actually allows us to trade more amongst ourselves. And the truth is, the more you trade amongst yourself, the more you deepen industrialization capacity, the more you deepen development structures, and the more you actually deepen your regional value chains and ensure that you can actually create more wealth on your continent. But beyond even creating wealth on your continent, you actually modernize and create a system of sophistication for your economy. And those are important things that the AfCFTA does. And that's why I think it's easily the most ambitious plan we've had in a while on the continent for prosperity, because it actually aligns with what the global system looks like for trade, for development, which is trade, cooperation, development, industrialization by interaction, by economic interaction and economic integration. And that just makes a lot more sense. And it actually follows the path of saying infrastructure would follow this path, development will follow this path, services will follow this path. On challenges more regularly, I think there are a number of challenges that potentially exist. And I think most of them have been flagged by, I think most of them have been flagged, but I'll just mention one that I think is a major challenge, which is that a number of industries could come under intense attack if the governments of those countries do not categorically and carefully plan and strategize for trade. And I think that's a big challenge we need to be careful of. To say that it's one thing to create all these industries, one thing to create all these agreements. It's another thing for industry and the government to actually start to use the tools that already exist. And I think that's a challenge and a threat. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all my panelists. We're going to go straight into the Q&A for participants. I have very limited time, so I'll try my best to pick as many as I can. I think this question is for Mr. Gumi. What should we expect from customs in 2021? Any changes in tariffs and duties? And what are they doing to streamline HS code to be more transparent? Mr. Gumi?
Hello, I can hear you. Customs are not policymakers. They don't fix the rate of duty. They only implement. What you expect by 2020 is simplified and harmonized process and procedure of doing business.
Okay, I have another question here for you from a participant. Yeah. Does the mutual administrative assistance rely mainly on information from third parties to trigger its risk-based interventions? I don't know.
No, not only third party, but also we receive from the regional level and continental level.
Okay. Okay, so the next question I have here is, how soon will the list of excluded and sensitive products be available to the public? Have negotiations on the rules of origin been concluded? If not, will it be concluded before the start of trading in January? I don't know who I should.
At the last meeting in Ghana, subcommittees were created to deal with such issues, and the subcommittees are to submit their report within 2 weeks. So I don't know whether they have done that, but I knew the last meeting that was held in Ghana, subcommittee were created to handle issues of rules of origin, tariff concession, market assets.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So those are all the questions I can take for now.
Hello, sorry, if I can just
interject. Yes, please. Yes, you can.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so basically, maybe if I can just support what he said. If you look at rules of origin currently, and then if you follow the summit, what happened is that in terms of the number of tariff lines, they've concluded negotiations or discussions on about 81%. Yeah, so they have a remainder in terms of about 90% that they have not yet completed. In terms of the start of trading on the 1st of January, what the summit is basically saying is that start of trading and then implementation of the agreement will start on the basis of the agreed rules of origin. So in other words, what has been agreed upon is what the implementation of the AfCFTA will start on. Then they've given a transitional period. By June, everything should be completed. The other question in terms of when we want to submit the 10% in terms of the 3% for sensitive and then the 3% for exclusions and then the 7% for sensitive product. I think the summit is meeting again in February, and in January, the AfCFTA Secretariat will be organizing a series of meetings. So I think a decision would then be taken as to when we should submit the remainder. But I think if you also look at even the 3% and then the 7%, it's not expected to start now. It's the 90% that immediate liberalization. If you look at the sensitive, for example, the sensitive will start 5 years after. So in the 6th year, that's when that one would also come in. Yeah. So for now, we just holding on to it once the decision is taken, and then we submit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all my panelists. This has been an interesting conversation. I've personally learned so much. Thank you for sharing from your extensive bank of knowledge. Looking forward to writing an article on the back of this. I'm going to now hand over to ACIOE Associate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to say, first of all, thank you to all our panelists and their respective organizations for their really their fantastic comments and insights. I want to especially thank Mr. Gumi from the Nigerian Customs Service. Thank you, sir, for always having an open door whenever we come to speak to you on trade, some tariffs, HS codes, and you have been quite hospitable, and we look forward to doing more. Mr. Peter Joy from ECOWAS, excellent comments. Thank you so much, sir. And thanks for all the great work with ECOWAS and the AfCFTA. Mr. Francis Anatogu, who's on the National Action Committee. He provided some really great insights on what Nigeria is doing, and we believe they're on the right track. Obviously, we have some challenges, but we'll get there. Mr. Tola Anayemi, you can clearly tell he's an international trade specialist. He knows his work, he knows his onions, and he provided excellent insights also. And an excellent job to Ms. Chinwe Egwim, who did an excellent job with the moderation. She has a wonderful book that is out. I encourage everybody to get her book. We provide thoughts on the, what do you call this, on the economics and some economical insights also. So I think you should definitely read her book. Look out for her, Chinwe Egwim. And also to the ACIOE team, doing Shola, Udwak, and Jennifer. Jennifer, we want to say happy birthday again. It was her birthday. And I just want to end off with just a few thoughts. I think what Tola said about the importance of currency in trade facilitation is very important. And I'll just say 5 key things that we should really think about. 1, the currency conversion across the continent, from Naira to other currencies across the continent. How do we trade with the shillings? How do we trade with South African Rand? All these are going to be important as we think about the AfCFTA. 2, reforms towards local production, especially around processing and packaging, are going to be important. 3, export reforms and incentives, especially for the fast-moving consumer goods and professional services, will be really important. 4, the movement of goods and services. Somebody highlighted it earlier on. So logistics is always going to be important. Infrastructure follows trade flows. And lastly, a deliberate political will. These are some really key items we have to think about in terms of the implementation of the AfCFTA to be successful. And I believe that with all this being considered and the great comments that our panelists made, it will definitely position Nigeria to be a great beneficiary for the AfCFTA. I want to once again thank everyone who has joined this conversation. An email we send tomorrow with a recording of this webinar, and we look forward to having the next series of webinar in January, focused on the AfCFTA. And we're actually having one next week on looking at the social impact sector and what has happened thus far. So once again, thank you. Say good afternoon, good morning your time, or good afternoon or good evening your time. Thank you very much. And whenever you have any policy questions or inquiries, especially around government relations, please call on us at ACIOE Associates. Thank you and God bless. Good afternoon.